All right, we're recording. Thank you for joining us on Record Live today. We have a very special guest today. He's had to join us in the evening his time because he's in the East Coast of America, and we're not live today, unfortunately. Although we record live, we've pre-recorded this and we're coming to you at a slightly different time than normal, but we're going to be online in the comments. So if you have any interactions or would like to respond in some way to the things that you're watching, we will still be here to answer your questions. I'll be here to answer your questions in the comments and to react and respond. So tell us where you're watching from, and we'd love to chat. I have a special guest today, Dr. David Trim. It's really great to have you, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me, Jared.
Now, Dr. Trim, you are at the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventists, the worldwide church headquarters, and you are responsible for, I wanted to make sure I got the research in because I always forget, but archives, statistics, and research.
That's
you're the
correct,
director
yes.
of that area, that department at the General Conference. Tell us a little bit about what is that department? Why is it important for a church to have a sort of, in a sense, it's dealing with history, but you're also putting out regularly statistics and trends in the church as they happen. So just tell us a little bit about that before we get into today's topic.
Surely, in some respects, the three areas, archive, statistics, and research, don't have to relate to each other. And it's partly perhaps a little bit of an organizational accident that they came to be combined in the one office, as it's called. It's effectively a department.
Right.
Archives, of course, is concerned with the church's records management program, preserving the institutional records of the General Conference, its divisions, and its institutions. That's a whole very large area of work. Statistics actually involves more than that implies, because we publish the Seventh-day Adventist yearbook, obviously annually, and we also publish each year the annual statistical report. So it's not only statistics, it's also other organizational information. The yearbook is a directory of all the church's organizations and institutions, of which, of course, there are thousands and thousands, and the people who work for them. So that's crucial information, especially for church leaders. And then we have the research, which is partly historical research, very often based largely on the collections in the archives and on the historical statistics. But we also do social science research, what's sometimes called human subject research, which is empirical survey-based data. And we release the findings of those, and that's very much focused on trends, though we also do trend analysis of the statistics. Each year we issue a report at the time of the church's annual council. So why is it important? Because the church needs to know its history, to know who it is today, and the church needs to have the information on statistics and the survey data in order to know where the church is going now. So I think in all of those respects, all three elements are really crucial for the church to have.
Yeah, I always pay attention to these reports that your department puts together around annual council time with things like retention rates of members and how many are joining the church and that sort of thing. It's really interesting and very important for us to grapple with some of the numbers, the good ones and the bad trends, I guess, in the church, because it's
the good
important
and the bad, absolutely,
to help us set direction and strategy as we go forward.
Yes, without that, you can't do any meaningful planning, and you're sort of operating in the dark. There's business schools have a mantra that says the first task of a leader is to define reality, which, I mean, doesn't mean in a sort of Vladimir Putin way where you make reality mean whatever you'd like it to mean and fit with your own preconceptions, but it's to say what actually is happening. And once you know what's really happening, then you can start to react and also take initiatives that allow you to preempt trends. So it really is a vital information, I think, for the church to have.
Now, David, you've got some Australian heritage, I believe, some English heritage. You're a bit of a man of the world. Just tell us a little bit about your background and some of the places you've been and worked before you arrived at the General Conference.
Yes. My late father was Australian. My mother is British. And I was actually born in India, in what was then called Bombay, today called Mumbai, because my
Mm,
parents worked there as missionaries. But when I was 5, we moved to my father's home city of Sydney in Australia, and I
mhm,
spent my boyhood there before going to Britain in my teenage years. Um, I studied at Newbold College, the Seventh-day Adventist college in the United Kingdom. And then I did a PhD, and I was fortunate enough to be appointed to teach at Newbold, which I did for 10 years. Then I taught at Pacific Union College, the church's college in Northern California, for 2 years. And then I was elected to my current position at Annual Council 2010.
mhm.
Um, when I was doing my PhD research, I lived for a number of months both in the Netherlands and in France, because that's where my archive collections were that I was working on. Um, and I can say that my wife, who I met at Newbold, is American from California. Um, and her brother is married to a Malaysian who he met when he was a missionary in Singapore. So I feel fairly international.
Yeah. So what do you say? What is I say I'm an Australian, but what would you claim yourself as, or do you say I'm a man of the world?
Well, I chiefly claim whatever's useful to me when I'm talking to somebody at any given moment. So when I'm in Southeast Asia, I play up my brother-in-law's connections, for example. When I'm in California, I stress my wife's connection. When I'm talking to Australians, of course, I stress my father and indeed my siblings, my brother and 3 sisters who all still live in Australia as it happens. Um,
Hmm.
and in Europe, I'm very much a European. I can speak a little bit of Dutch and French, and I make use of that. So I have a very flexible identity, Jared, and I claim
Like
whatever's most useful for me at the given moment.
like Paul, you become all things to all people.
Well, not quite. I mean, I think of myself, I have to say, primarily as British, but the
Yes.
Australian side is important to me.
Yep. Beautiful. Well, you've got some background in, I guess, military conflicts and in terms of study. Sorry, I should preface that. Some of the specialty of your, I understand your dissertation was on the military sort of side of things. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Because we've got a conflict raging in Europe that's on everyone's minds at the moment, and just as an observer in Australia, we don't feel like that is going to impact us, perhaps physically just yet. We know that there's a flow-on effect from economies, and things are starting to be talked
Yes.
about, petrol prices, that sort of thing. But it got me thinking, if I was a young Adventist person in Europe, how would I be feeling about the potential for military service, the potential to have to defend my country if I'm a
Mm,
Ukrainian, or be sent over to Ukraine if I'm, say, a Russian young person. Um, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? How am I? So I guess if we start with your sort of just your background in on that side of things, because I think that's
yes.
important to understand where you've come from, and what you've studied, and where your research areas lie. And then we'd really like to today look at some of the Adventist attitudes to military service and some of the history of, I guess, where and how that's developed through the ages. Um,
Right. So, yes, I'm originally a military historian, which is kind of ironic for a church that, as we will discuss, has a very strong non-combatant stance.
yeah.
But that was just what happened to interest me.
Hmm.
So, my PhD dissertation, as you say, was on actually on war and religion. So it sort of brings in the religious side of things. I looked at the
Right.
wars of religion in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, and at religion as a motivation for combat.
Hmm.
But up until I came to the General Conference, about half of my publications were on religious history, but about half were on military history,
Yes.
including quite technical military history, such as a co-authored history of amphibious warfare. So that's fairly
Okay.
hardcore military history, I like to think. Um, I haven't done so much of that since I came to my current position because I've been naturally drawn into Seventh-day Adventist history. But my background is very much as a military historian. My PhD actually was in war studies at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, which was the first department of war studies in the world. And so, yes, I retain a keen interest in the history of warfare, but then equally I do bring to it an Adventist sensibility. And indeed, I may say, when I was a boy, I went to a school in Sydney that was called Knox Grammar School, not far down the road, actually, from where you're sitting right now recording this, I think, Jared. And they were a very traditional boys' private school, and so they had a cadet corps. And my parents had to write a letter and have me exempted from service in the cadet corps, partly because of Sabbath, but partly also because they did get trained with firearms. And my parents felt that was at odds with the church's non-combatant stance, that the church didn't encourage members not to bear arms, and they didn't want me to be bearing arms. So, which again makes it all the more ironic that I became a military historian. But that's just, you're interested in what you're interested in, if I may put it that way. But I've always, so since I was 13 and had that experience in year 8 of high school, having to make a stand, as it were. Obviously my parents did it, but for my school mates, all they saw was somebody standing out from the crowd. So I was always keenly aware of the Adventist non-combatant stance. And also, some of my parents' friends had served in the Australian Armed Forces in World War II and done so as medics, as non-combatants. So it's something that's always been in my mind, is what the church's stance in, as well as what my personal and professional interests have been.
That's really interesting. How did you feel, just to understand that, about that as a young boy? It was probably your parents pushing that, or as you were grappling with that, did you feel sort of any, was it complex for you? Or were you this is really good, I'm glad that I'm standing up for something?
It was complex. I did feel glad to take a stand, and I knew that Adventists had been taking a stand for many years. And yet at the same time, quite a lot of the things about the cadet corps are interesting. You march, you camp, there's a number of most of the activities didn't actually involve firing guns or any kind of real training for military, for war. And also there was a great deal of camaraderie, and being separated from that is hard, especially when you're 13 and 14. Nobody likes to stand out from the from the crowd and be the one who's awkward and different. And there were a handful of other boys whose parents, not Seventh-day Adventists, but held similar points of view, who were pacifists. But so, yes, it was complex. There were parts of me that wished that I could be part of it. And yet at the same time, I did feel, that it, in an odd way, I almost felt privileged that I could make that witness.
It's probably at a very formative age as well. So that sort of speaks to how it's in some ways followed you your whole career. Some of this stuff you've been wrestling with for many, many years.
Yes, I think so.
Going to the Adventist church now. So we've always had this wrestle. The church was formed in America, officially in the 1860s. And we know that the American Civil War was happening just around,
absolutely,
the formative years of the church. So I imagine this has been an issue that Adventists have had to deal with since the very beginning, essentially, since almost the very beginnings of the church. Can you take us through sort of how some of the attitudes even started towards non-combatancy? Where do we pick those up from?
Right. Yes. Since the very beginning of the church, and actually before the beginning of the church, the American Civil War started in 1861. The church was formally organized in 1863. Of course, there were antecedents. And so it was affecting us even before we'd formed the General Conference in May of 1863. And the American Civil War was difficult for Adventists because the overwhelming majority of American Seventh-day Adventists lived in the North and were strongly abolitionist. So for them, the war against slavery wasn't just a regular war; it was a moral cause, and a number of them had risked arrest by helping escaped slaves who were trying to escape to Canada. Which didn't have slavery because it was a part of the British Empire, which had abolished slavery decades earlier. And so Adventists had risked arrest to help slaves. Adventists were quite engaged on behalf of free blacks or freed slaves who did live in the North. And here you have this cause that's erupted on your doorstep. But Adventists mostly, as far as we can tell, or if not mostly, many of them came from a background that didn't believe in war. There were almost no Adventist Quakers being the best known pacifist church. There were almost no Adventists who came out of the Quaker movement or out of the Mennonites. Adventists mostly were Baptists and various forms of Methodist, and a few Presbyterians and Episcopalians. But they very much believed in peace, and that peace was what Christ taught and the Christian church taught. And so Adventists were torn in the 1860s. And so, and even though the church itself eventually by 1864 declares itself to be a peace church along the lines of the Quakers and Mennonites, the fact is that probably at least 300 Seventh-day Adventists served in the Union Army and did so as volunteers. And just to give you some context, the total membership of the church then was probably around 3,000 to 3,500. So you're talking about 10% of the total membership, and maybe a third of men who would have been of military service age. And so there's a kind of confusion in early Adventist history about whether war is in and of itself evil, or whether there can be some kinds of wars which were acceptable. And this builds on a very long Christian history of what's known as just war theory, that in medieval Christendom, Christians tried to identify what wars are acceptable to fight and what are sinful for Christians to fight. And so Adventists were building on this just war tradition. And though you don't find, or at least I've never found, and have been doing research on this recently, I may say, even before the Ukrainian war, though I've never found Adventists overtly using the terminology of just war, you can see that it's in their minds. And that for a number of Seventh-day Adventists, the American Civil War, especially once it becomes a war about slavery, which it wasn't originally, it was a war about preserving the Union, but it comes to be about abolishing slavery. Eventually, that becomes one of the war aims of the North. And once that's the case, then Adventists would say, well, this is a just war, and indeed it's a holy cause. What makes it more complicated is that for Adventists, slavery is extremely important in their eschatological and apocalyptic understanding. Adventists believe that America is the two-horned beast, the lamb-like beast. It's going to apostate Protestantism. Why are they so confident of that? Partly because of slavery. They can look and say, you see, America claims all these beneficent things, but really it's responsible for this utterly iniquitous system, which shows the hypocrisy that it's at the root of America. So for Adventists, it wasn't just that they were abolitionists, but slavery played an absolutely crucial part in their apocalyptic understanding, which is something we've lost sight of today because, of course, slavery is no longer an issue. But for Adventists in the 1860s, slavery was the mark of apostate Protestantism. So Adventists, especially, they, for multiple reasons, they can look at the American Civil War and say, well, Christ teaches peace, but isn't this war unusual? And so I think that's why you get this statistically significant group of Adventists willing to fight in the Union Army.
Moving from the American Civil War, perhaps 50 or so years later, there was the First World War, and that was much more Europe. There were much more European Adventists involved in this one. And I think the history of sort of non-combatancy, well, there is that American element, being an American-based or originating in America, that church, that, you know, it seems to me that in America and Australia, without conscription, without sort of as many sort of wars to fight since probably, you know, Vietnam, that have been sort of pulling everyone in, we've sort of lost what the official Adventist sort of attitudes towards war, the current. We're not necessarily on the cutting edge of some of this conversation, but in Europe, it's still a very present thing, because I know a number of countries there have sort of service that's required for young
Right.
people. So just tell us how that transitioned, or how it evolved over time as sort of the world wars impacted on the world scene.
So yes, you're right. 50 years after the church is founded, and just under 50 years after the end of the American Civil War, the First World War breaks out in Europe. Initially, of course, America is neutral, which means Adventists don't have to make a decision, or at least they didn't in America, but in Europe they did. And every European country except Great Britain, every other European country in 1914 had conscription, in which basically every young man, once he turned a certain age, with a few exemptions, had to do a year of military service, and then he was in the Army Reserve for years afterwards. And this is how Europe was able to muster armies in the millions, because a very significant proportion of the male population had done military service and then were part of the Army Reserve. In Australia, of course, the Army Reserve is a big thing, or at least it was when I lived there. But it's relatively small, and it's it's a volunteer force. European armies in 1914, the reserves were former conscripts, and they had no option but to serve. But at the same time, European countries in 1914, the needs for manpower are great, because, of course, the First World War elevates killing to a new art form. Casualties are massive. And so countries are looking for young men to volunteer as well. And unfortunately, the German church, and let me just say the German church was extremely significant. The country with the largest number of Adventists outside the United States of America was Germany.
Right. Yeah.
And German Adventism in the first 15 years of the 20th century was growing faster than American Adventism. And so if it hadn't been for the First World War, one can actually imagine a history in which Germany and America were twin poles, as it were, of world Adventism, as opposed to America being, you know, for many years the great center and heartland.
Wow. Yep.
Which is an interesting counterfactual, you know, with what might have been. But instead, what actually happens is the war breaks out, and the German church, which had cooperated with German government officials far more than, say, in America, where, of course, there's a very different tradition of the state. German church officials had cooperated with German government officials for a number of years. And in 1914, the German church tells its young men, you should volunteer for the army, and you shouldn't be afraid to serve on Sabbath and even to kill. So here is it's not just that the church isn't encouraging young men to stay out. The church is saying, go, join the German army, and don't be afraid of serving on Sabbath. If there's try and keep Sabbath if you can. But if there's a battle on Sabbath, it's okay to fight and it's okay to kill, because you're doing it for your country. So this is completely at odds with the American Adventist tradition, and it's also at odds with the tradition in Britain, perhaps because Britain was closer to American Adventism than to German Adventism, just because of the way the church grows in Europe. It grows separately in Scandinavia, Germany, and Britain. And in Britain, you have Adventist young men refusing to bear arms and being imprisoned and being treated brutally by the British Army for refusing, and the British authorities for refusing to bear arms. There was no understanding of conscientious objectors in the First World War. By the Second World War, things are different. But in the First World War, conscientious objectors were treated as pariahs by society, and they suffered really brutal consequences. So you have this odd situation that in Britain, young men are being brutalized by the state for refusing to bear arms, Adventist young men, that is, whereas in Germany, their church is encouraging them and is even setting up recruiting stations in local churches to help speed the German war effort.
Do you have any indication as to why that was? Was there just a flavor of nationalism in the church at the time, or was it just, how did they justify something like that? Because the Sabbath for Adventists is the paramount thing. Like, whether it should be as important as it is, it's the main pillar. It's one of the reasons you're an Adventist. And to say, I just can't imagine church leaders saying, go do anything else on Sabbath.
Well, and to be fair, the German
fighting.
church said, keep Sabbath when you can. But if there's a battle and you're being called into service, then it's okay. But it's interesting, the compromises that had been made. And I don't think American church leaders realized the compromises, because America didn't have conscription. It did during the American Civil War. It did after America entered the First World War. But you have 50 years in which conscription doesn't exist in America, and American church leaders probably have no real understanding of what's happening in Europe, except for the few Americans who actually go and serve there as missionaries. What had been happening is that Adventist young men had been being conscripted to do their year or 18 months of compulsory military service, and they had tried to take a stand. And I've traced this through historically, and what you can see is that the church in Germany especially, but also in France, in Switzerland, in Scandinavia, and in Eastern Europe, countries like Romania and Bulgaria, the church basically says to its young men, hold fast for Sabbath. And don't drink, don't smoke, don't do all the corrupting things that soldiers tend to do, to be honest. Hold fast for the Sabbath truth. But what they compromise on is bearing arms and preparing to kill. And I think, they give reports back to the church leaders in America about how these young men have been conscripted and are valiantly willing to be imprisoned rather than to do service on a Sabbath. And Americans therefore lose sight of the compromise that has been made, that they've decided to hold the line on the Sabbath, but not on refusing to bear arms. And so I think you get to 1914, and probably European church leaders think Americans understand this and have approved it. And in fact, Americans didn't understand it. They were probably oblivious to it, and were shocked when they learned that the German church leaders are saying, yes, it's fine. In fact, it's a good thing to serve the Kaiser, to serve in the German army. I do think it's different culture. America, of course, is a very different, much freer society than any European society, except perhaps Britain was in the early 20th century. Far more democratic, far more individual freedoms and liberties. And so American Adventists were able to keep at arm's length from the state. And of course, American Adventists believed that the state was going to compromise with the Roman Catholic Church and persecute them. So of course they were cautious about the American state, because it was going to be apostate Protestantism and usher in the end times by persecuting them. So of course they're wary of it. And I think German Adventists cooperated far more with state officials, and so there was just a different culture. And so that's why in 1914 you get this different result. As I say, the church in Britain didn't really get any missionaries from the church in Central Europe. Its missionaries came direct from America, and I think it therefore had a different set of attitudes, and it continued to rely on American leadership all the way through into the early 20th century, whereas the church in Germany had acquired native-born leaders who therefore were steeped more in the local culture. I mean, we could talk about this for a lot more, and we don't have time. But, the First World War really is this crucial moment in Adventist history. Yes. And the thing is, there are German Adventists who were aware what the church had taught in the Civil War and said, we're a peace church. Adventists don't believe in bearing arms. Christ taught peace. We should be peaceful. And so they're appalled when the German church becomes so militaristic. And in fact, the origins of the Seventh-day Adventist reform movement, which is the
Right.
one major schism from Adventism,
Mm-hmm.
were the German Adventists who said, we can't do military service. It's against Christian teachings. It's against our Adventist
Yeah.
history. And so the church in Germany is actually fatally weakened. And this is one reason you don't get that hypothetical history of Germany becoming the second pole of American Adventism, of Adventism along with America, because the church splits in Germany over this
Mm-hmm.
whole issue of military service. And at the same time, as I say, you've got British young men being arrested. Well, if just to fast forward, in 1917, America enters the war and introduces conscription. So
Mm-hmm.
suddenly American Adventists, for the first time since 1863, and 64 and 65 are having to make a decision.
Yeah.
And they want to be regarded as good and loyal citizens. They don't wish to be regarded as rebellious. They don't wish to have the government place them under sanctions, which would limit their mission. And so they say, yes, our tradition that came out of the Civil War, we say we're a peace church. But the key thing is that we'll say Adventists don't bear arms. Adventists don't kill. They will serve in their country's armed forces. They will do so loyally as faithful citizens, but they will keep Sabbath and they will refuse to bear arms. And as it happened, because of America's different religious character than, say, Britain, there was more sympathy for this in America than there was in Britain, and it was possible for Adventist young men to become conscientious objectors and to say, we will serve in the army, but I won't personally carry or shoot a gun. And so by 1920, the church in Germany has gone into a prolonged period of introspection as it tries to work out what went wrong and what should their view in the future be. Little knowing that Nazism was going to come along.
And they've split as well, haven't they, the church? So you're saying that there's the Reformed Church and the mainstream, I guess,
the mainstream church. Right. So Germany is involved in this, and in America, you get this, the church settles on, without ever having done, I have to say, a prolonged period of Bible study to say, what is the biblical teaching? It's kind of reaction. Right. It reacts to the situation in the 1860s. Okay. It reacts to the situation in 1917. And I think it reacts with so that it's not like the truth of the Sabbath or the sanctuary or the state of the dead, where Adventists spend, or the predecessors of Seventh-day Adventists spend several years studying the Bible intensely to say, what is the Bible teaching? I think they came with a certain set of presumptions in the 1860s, and then that becomes, as it were, the traditional Adventist position. And what you get in the 1920s is Adventists in North America saying, this is the compromise that we'll stick with. We will be good citizens. And this is one reason the Reformed Church splits off and splits entirely from the mainstream church, because it says you can't even be a conscientious objector in an army. You can't serve in an army at all, full stop. And so it regards the American Adventist Church as having apostatized as well, because it now says you can serve, but so long as you don't carry and shoot a gun. But American Adventists sort of say, this is the compromise. We will be loyal citizens. We'll do as the government says, but only up to a point.
So let's fast forward a little bit. I could talk about this history all day. It's fascinating to me. But you mentioned, I just want to pick up, you mentioned that sort of the real Bible study, the seeking wasn't done. It was just a reactionary. Has that been done since, do you feel? Or have some of those attitudes carried on? And what's the current sort of official stand of the church? And then is there a spectrum of things? Is there a clear church guidelines or church statements on this issue that we can find?
There are, and eventually the church did start to study them. It started to study the matter in the late 1920s and the 1930s, at which point it was beginning to become only too likely that there would be another major war. Of course, World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. By the early 30s, it's plain that another major war in Europe is on the horizon, and America may well get pulled into it. And in any case, the church needs guidance to give its European members, and it's also, there's a fair chance that America, which is still the major center of Adventism, is going to could get pulled into a war. So you have to have a position. So Adventists do engage in study and reflection, and there are Adventists who actually, there's a full gamut of opinions. There are Adventists who say we should support just war. If a war is just, according to the criteria that had long been established in Western civilization, if a war is just, then it's legitimate for somebody to serve and even to kill. And there are those who say it's legitimate to kill because the government has commanded it, so the sin is the government's, it's not the individual, because the individual is merely following through on what the government says. So you've got that position on one extreme, and on the other position, you've got Seventh-day Adventists who say you can't compromise with the government with military service at all. Even if you're serving as a non-combatant, as a doctor or a medic, you're still serving the cause of killing, and there can be no kind of compromise. So you've got Adventists in the interwar period who cover every position from those two and everything in between. But in the end, the church in the 30s settles on the position that it had come to in 1917, I won't say by accident, but without perhaps as much thought as it might have done, and says, no, the New Testament has various things that are said plainly about loyally serving governments, except you have to serve God rather than man. But up to that point, also, if Adventists completely reject any military service, we're far more likely to be repressed by governments, and that's going to affect our mission. And so Adventists will always put mission above everything else. And I think
it's a pragmatic decision, you're saying.
It's partly Adventists will always say the mission has to come first. Of course, nobody would say we'll compromise on Sabbath or in order to but where there's some room for compromise, where there's some room for adaptability and flexibility, we'll go with what enables our mission to be most effective. And so the church eventually, having, as I say, had this almost internal debate between these radically different concepts, says, no, we will be loyal citizens, we'll cooperate, which means the government will allow us to continue operating, but we will, as much as possible, honor Sabbath. Wherever possible, our servicemen will honor the Sabbath. We'll encourage our young men and women not to smoke or drink or otherwise compromise with morals. And above all, we will not carry or use firearms. And so that's the position that gets taken into World War II. And that's the position that Australians inherit. Whereas, and my generation can remember Anzac Day marches at which there actually were veterans of World War II marching down the streets of Sydney and so forth. And there were quite a number of Adventists, but they had almost all been non-combatants. And non-combatant conscientious objection becomes the church's position. Well, fast forward through to the 1950s, Western countries, not Europe, there's no war in Europe, but you have the Korean War, which affects America and Britain and Australia. And so the church has to underscore its position. And so the current church's position was actually adopted in 1954. A document was voted by that year's Autumn Council called Relationships to Civil Governments and War. And it basically reiterates the position that it puts into one document the position that had emerged by the 1940s and says you serve, but you serve within certain moral constraints, which include not carrying and firing a gun. And the Korean War is over, but within 10 years of the end of that, you have the Vietnam War, which still is including Australia and the United States. And you're getting a very large number of young Adventist men being conscripted because as the need for servicemen grows, they conscript more young men in America. So suddenly you're getting a lot of Adventist young men conscripted in the 1960s, and the church maintains the 1954 position. And then eventually the draft gets abolished in America once it's plain that the Vietnam War has been lost, exactly as happens in Australia. They abolish the draft.
Mm-hmm.
And the church reiterates in 1972 at that year's Autumn Council, it votes a statement which is a reaffirmation of the 1954 document. So the church has a very clear official position, but it says it leaves it up to the conscience of the individual. The church's position is that young Adventists should serve as non-combatants, as conscientious objectors, or as some Adventists like to say, conscientious cooperators,
Mm-hmm.
because even though we object to bearing firearms, we are serving in the army. So conscientious cooperator is an Adventist. Conscientious objector is a term that came into existence before Adventists. Conscientious cooperator is our own invention.
Right. Yep.
And so there is a very clear church position that said Adventists who are called into military service should be conscientious objectors. They shouldn't bear firearms, but we leave it up to the individual conscience. Well, if we can fast forward even more, Jared, in 1972, the church had a lot of expertise on military service, especially in America, but then America was still 25% of the world church at that point.
Yes.
And it affected Australia as well, which had the draft. And it affected European countries. European countries maintained conscription because they were expecting to be invaded by the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union and its Eastern allies all had massive armies. So European countries all had conscription, and Adventist young men all had to face certain choices. So up till 1972, the church had a lot of expertise, and the church's position was very well known and very well understood by all young people because, hey, the young person might be facing conscription, and you needed to know what you were going to do and what you were going to say.
So we would teach on it, right? So we would, when you say it
Yes.
had to be well known, it was something that we would emphasize and train our young people to know what the stance of the church was.
It was taught in schools, and it was something taught in young people's groups, in youth Adventist youth societies, and so forth. Well, in the 1980s, the Cold War ends, and European countries mostly abolish conscription. There are still countries in the world that have conscription, but the number has fallen and fallen. And the church's position with the passage of time is no longer well known. It's no longer well understood. And you actually have the situation now, where for many American Adventists, America's no longer the center of the church, of course, but it's still, a lot of the world looks to America as a kind of pattern. It's influential. Yeah, nicely put. Yep. It's the case now that for many American young people, they will just volunteer to join the Army or the Navy and the Air Force. And you've got to understand there's a difference between conscription and volunteering. And if you were to go back and read through old issues of the Record from the 1940s, Jared, they would be full of letters from Australian Adventist young men who were serving in the military, but talking about how they were honoring the Sabbath still. And American young men were able to do the same. Why? Because, and this is where my military history expertise comes in, I can tell you armies understood in the First and Second World Wars that and especially the Second World War, you had to treat people differently when they were conscripts than when they were volunteers. Britain and America and Australia become nations under arms, and you have vast numbers of people who in peacetime would never conceivably be in the armed forces, who are suddenly now being required by their government to serve, and military leaders understand you can't treat these people the same way you would professional soldiers who joined up voluntarily at the age of 18 and have been serving for years. So why does that matter? For all the young people who volunteer to join the American armed forces or other countries' armed forces, they're not getting Sabbath privileges. They are bearing arms because, hey, they've volunteered. Nobody's forced them. This is their choice, and so they can't expect special treatment. And so the church's position, even while it's never been reversed or changed in any way, has in effect been eroded by the behavior of Adventist young people who have forgotten our very noble, I think, our very noble history of refusing to kill, who have forgotten that and who really have no sense of the sacrifices that generations of Adventist young men and women made during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s and early 70s in order to hold to these principles.
And in some ways we've mythologized or lionized some of these characters. Desmond Doss, our A Thousand Shall Fall, I forget his name in the book, the biography, A Thousand Shall
Yes.
Fall, the German soldier who kept the Sabbath, didn't bear arms, did all the things, and we like those stories as Adventists. We tell those stories, but perhaps we've, as you mentioned, lost the difference between conscription and volunteering. Being drafted and being forced essentially to fight. You're saying,
right?
The government's not so much in World War I. I know you mentioned some of the persecution for the British young men, also thrown in prison and stuff because they refused. And so we forget that some of those sacrifices paved the way for later Adventists to be able to do the right thing and conscientiously cooperate. I think you said.
Yes. Absolutely,
Desmond
Jared.
Doss
No,
volunteered.
that's right.
Did he volunteer?
No, he was drafted.
Okay.
His number came up, as they say.
In the I believe in the movie, they make it seem like he was dead keen to go. He was passionate, He
well, and he may have been because America had been attacked. It's you mentioned the Ukraine at the start. America didn't, unlike in 1917 when America entered the war completely of its own volition. In 1941, America was attacked, and in very dastardly fashion as well.
Yes.
So obviously, for many young Adventists, they must have wanted to help serve their country in its hour of need. But I think you're right. I think by telling those stories, also, what do those stories, Desmond Doss has a degree of heroism that I can't understand. I can't even begin to comprehend. And I think the heroism is admirable. But when you tell these stories, the two that you mentioned and others, you're telling stories that praise people who were soldiers. In effect, the subtext that I think many young Adventists taking away from that would be, it's fine to serve in the army.
Yes. Yeah.
And the distinction, again, as you rightly say, I think between voluntarism and conscription is lost. And I'm sure there are young Adventists who've joined up thinking, oh, I've read about Desmond Doss keeping the Sabbath. I'll be able to keep the Sabbath. And it's a shock when they're not, but by then they're in and they make the compromise. And I think it's not widely understood in the culture, the sacrifice that you're making if you volunteer as opposed to being conscripted. But, let's bring it closer to home, Jared. Maybe not in Australia, but in parts of Europe right now, I guarantee you there will be defense ministries that are looking at their old plans for conscription and dusting them off. Because if Russia was, Russia's attacked the Ukraine, what if it were to say, well, actually, the Baltic republics were historically part of the Russian Empire. We'll have them next. Well, they are part of NATO, and NATO doesn't have the choice to stand aloof. And I bet you in Washington, D.C., just down the road from me, the Department of Defense is looking at its plans. And you know what? The legislation for the draft in America has never been abolished.
Right.
The legislative framework is still there.
It's sitting there ready to go.
It's sitting there ready to go when they need it. And I don't mean to be alarmist. I don't think a major war is about to break out. But I think looking at the world as we do today, the confidence that there's not going to be a major war that might involve young Adventists being called up to military service, that confidence is not going to be there at the moment.
Yeah. I know I've heard from some Polish friends. There's a lot of nervous,
yes, well,
a lot of nervous Adventists in Poland and other countries. Obviously, Romania has a large Adventist population as well, just next door to Ukraine, who are we can say doing admirable things with ADRA and opening their borders and helping Ukrainian refugees. But yeah, I guess it brings us to the current conflict in another sense, that I guess some Adventists or some people might be looking at Ukraine as a just war, potentially that Russia's aggressions are unjust, are perhaps sinful, but that to defend your home, your country, your family, where the lines of they're asking for volunteers, they're not necessarily conscripted, and some people might be tempted to join that because they may feel they have no other choice. I don't know if you've got any perspective or any thoughts on how whether there's anything from history that can inform this kind of situation, or your understanding of what constitutes a just war as to how do we navigate the current conflict in Ukraine?
I mean, well, firstly, just to step aside from the Adventist question for a moment, there's no question but that the Ukraine's position is a just war. It fits the classical criteria of a just war.
Okay. Yep.
So if anyone was to say Ukraine's war of self-defense is a just war, I mean, that's undeniable, except probably by the Russian government.
Yep.
But it's palpably so. The question then is what do Adventists do with that? And of course, the church's position is one of encouragement and guidance. But it leaves it up to the individual conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Just as, keeping the Sabbath is ultimately up to the individual conscience. When people might lose their job because they want to keep the Sabbath and they're being asked to work on Friday night or Saturday afternoon, very often what happens is that employers say to the church, can't you give them an exemption? And the church leaders the answer to that question is always, no, because it's God's requirement. It's not ours. If they choose to do it, it's up to them, but we can't exempt anyone from doing it. So there's an awful lot that the church leaves up to the individual conscience. Of course, keeping the Sabbath is one of our fundamental beliefs. So it is on a different plane to military service. But
in the sense of we don't
clear position.
We don't put out rules on what you should and shouldn't do on the Sabbath. We agree everyone should keep the Sabbath to be a Seventh-day Adventist, but we don't say how in particular you should do that. And so
exactly
in the same way, so churches do, the Religious Liberty Department and others will go into bat for or support members who are struggling with Sabbath or having things unfair, perhaps working conditions put on them about the Sabbath that they perhaps haven't had in the past. If it's instituted at their workplace, the church will support those. Do you see that the church in conscription countries would also support young people who were being forced to do things they weren't keen to do?
Very much so.
In that sense, yeah.
And indeed, in again, coming to our primary examples of the United States and Australia, the religious liberty and the youth departments did a lot on behalf of Adventist young men when they were called up. And I know people, both Australian and American, who were called before a draft tribunal, and they had to show that their pacifism, that their non-combatancy was moral and principled and not just an excuse for not doing their duty, which is how the draft tribunal saw things, of course. These were people who were wanting to weasel out of it and get out of their duty by pretending something that wasn't true. And so the Religious Liberty Department, the Youth Department, would work and help with young men and women but particularly young men who face these kinds of situations. And where the church can and has a religious liberty work, it would still help young people who are facing conscription in order to make whatever principled stand that they think is best, hopefully one that is in accordance with the church's encouragement and guidelines. But the church will work with them to support them as they make a stand for conscience.
Well, listen, David, it's been really great having you on. We are running out of time.
Yes.
you're working on a project. You mentioned it to me before we came on here. Can you just tell us really briefly about that, and perhaps when that's going to be available? I understand you're working on a book about some of this information that will be very helpful, I think, to the conversation that we've been having today, to inform more widely people about some of the issues that we've talked about.
Yes, I'm working with two colleagues at Andrews University, Dr. Jiří Moskala and Dr. John Reeve. We're co-editing a collection of essays on Seventh-day Adventists, Seventh-day Adventist war and military service. Part 1 is biblical perspectives, part 2 is theological perspectives, and part 3 is historical perspectives, and actually setting out the Seventh-day Adventist history. And so what in talking to you as I have done here, I'm drawing not only on my own research, but on the contributors to that book, who I've ruthlessly appropriated their ideas and research in order to share it with you. That book, we hope, will come out towards the end of this year. It will be published by Pacific Press.
Perfect. And I think, I'll be very interested in taking a look when that's available. Hey, Dr. David Trim, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll catch you all again next week on Record Live.
Thanks for having me, Jared.